Hey YouTube, it's Dan here again. I want to talk to you a little bit about diversification and what that means and what that could look like in your life. I don't know if you've ever heard of Natchez, Mississippi before, but it's not too far from where I live. And during the cotton boom of the American South, Natchez was rich. It was extremely rich. In fact, there were a couple of banks. One of them was in Natchez, and another one was in Louisiana. It was called the Citizens Bank of Louisiana. And those banks individually and uh, and also collectively, they had more money than any bank in the United States. Any bank in the places we think are big cities and big monetary centers now. And it's because of cotton. Cotton was king. And these people made lots of money selling cotton, planting cotton, hauling cotton, ginning cotton. Everything was cotton. Cotton was king. It really was. And it made certain people enormously wealthy, certain families enormously wealthy. In fact, you didn't even have to necessarily grow it or harvest it yourself or have anybody to do that, like slaves or workers or anybody else. One of those houses over there, uh, it's called Stanton Hall. The man who had that house built for his wife, he had 6 plantations, okay? As I recall, 4 of them were in Mississippi, and 2 of them were across the river in Louisiana. If you're not aware, Natchez, Mississippi is on the Mississippi River, which was important for commerce and for trade and things like that. It was a big waterway, and it still is. But that particular man made the bulk of his money not from the typical things that you hear about cotton, you know, uh, having slaves and having them pick it and all that and having it ginned up. He made the bulk of his money by being a cotton broker. And he was putting buyers and sellers together. In fact, in that house, you can go today and you can go and have a tour of it if you want to. Uh, the very desk where he did that in a front room. Now, outside, they had a place where you could roll up and tie up your wagon. And they had like a big stone block where you could step down off your wagon, being all fancy. Well, you come in the house and he had basically, it was his office right there, and they would sit down at this desk and they would sign documents. And he was a broker. That's really what he was doing. He was a cotton broker. And in current parlance, or what you might be more aware of today, this is what a company called Amazon is doing. They're a broker of sorts. They're putting buyers and sellers together. Anyway, uh, back to this place, Natchez. There's a very, very large house there called Longwood. Longwood, that's the name of the house. It is a gigantic house. It's unlike anything you've probably ever seen or heard or really can imagine. You get off this video, you can Google it and see what a picture of it looks like. It the man who had that place built or started to build it because it was not completed was a man named Nutt, Nutt. He was a rich man on account of cotton, just like a lot of other folks that were around that area. Uh, but this house it's like a mall. It's like it's truly ridiculous. Okay, now the house was never completed, and if you get a chance to go to Natchez and have a tour of it, I highly recommend it. It's truly an experience to to see something like that. But the house is kind of a Moroccan style, I think, and it's octagon shaped. And it's got these ornate little columns, and the porch goes all the way around. It's got a cupola on the top of it. The thing is just massive. I don't even know the square footage. I used to know and keep up with it, but it's just, you could probably put, 8 houses of anything you're familiar with and still not make the square footage of the inside of this thing. Well, this man was a baller, Mr. Nutt. He was a baller for sure. Him and his whole family, and they had it going on their plantation right there in Natchez. They lived in the most wealthy place. They had all the finest things, and they were building a house that even to this day, which this was prior to the Civil War, the American Civil War. Even to this day, there's nothing like it, to my knowledge, in the whole United States. So it's a work of art, and he wanted to have something nice for his family. And I understand that, and if you can afford it, that's a good thing to do. Well, guess what happened? The Civil War broke out. The Civil War, and it affected a lot of families and a lot of people, and due to different economic circumstances that between nations with France and England and the northern part of the United States, and at the time the Confederate States, this led to a collapse of the cotton market, on which all these people had put their hopes and dreams on, and to that point, rightly so. I mean, it was the Bitcoin of the day. They were doing all that and making lots of money and financing their lifestyles and doing very well. And if you had run into somebody at that time and they were going to go into cotton, well, you would just expect that they're going to be coming into some money, provided they can get started. But when the cotton market collapsed, uh, there was nowhere to, nothing you could do with all that cotton, even though you had lots of it. And the prices all collapsed, and a lot of that was going to England and Europe, and they were spinning that cotton into thread and fabric and different things like that, textiles. But since there was no exports as a result of the war, and you couldn't get your cotton to market, so to speak, the cotton was pretty much useless. And people think that slaves were free, but there was nothing free about a slave. There was money, that you had to pay to get one. I know it's immoral and wrong, but you had to pay to get one, and then if you had one or a bunch, they're people, and they have to eat and they have to have something to live in. So you might have had them in squalor or not feeding them very well, but you had to feed them and keep them going so they would do the work that you wanted them to do. So what I mean by that is when the cotton market collapsed and there was nothing to do with all that amazing cotton that you had collected, and then you got all these mouths to feed now, which is your own family, and in addition to these slaves that you had relied upon, all these little birds with their mouths are open. They're all hungry. Everybody's hungry. And what are we going to do? And stuff like that. And of course, along during the Civil War, also, President Lincoln, he made the famous Emancipation Proclamation and declared uh, some property at the time in another country, which was the Confederate States, that they were free. So if me and you were slaves and all our family was slaves, and we heard about that through the grapevine, we would wonder if that applied to us. And we might be less inclined to work. We might have loyalty to the family in some way, but we would wonder if we had to work, or maybe if we had other opportunities. So everything was kind of in disarray, and across the South generally, but this was particularly heartfelt and difficult to deal with in Natchez, because some of these people and some of these families had truly been living in luxury, uh, sadly on the backs of slave labor, at least in large part. But they had been enjoying, a lot of luxury and cush lifestyle, and they could have things imported from Europe, which was extremely expensive at the time. Have it brought over by a ship and not get lost at sea or something like that. But those people found themselves with a commodity that was no good to them. They had cotton, and they could boast how they used to do and how wealthy they used to be, but at this time that I'm talking about, they were destitute, really. And some of these people were faced with, uh, well, you've seen on Gone with the Wind, which of course is a movie, but that the taxes needed to be paid on their plantation, and that's true. But that was a real thing. You had to pay taxes. So some of these people, they couldn't sell their commodity, which was cotton, and they had to feed all these mouths that were open in the hopes that they might be able to recover one day. And but they wondered where to go and what to do, and how to proceed. You know, I think anybody in a circumstance like that would wonder. But anyway, this woman, Mr. Nutt's wife, the man that was such a baller with his giant house and everything. Well, this woman that had had such a fantastic life, and her husband was building this enormous mall of a house for her and her family. Well, in the middle of all these circumstances and world events, Mr. Nutt died. Poor old Mr. Nutt, he died. So she's even in a worse state than she was before. So what am I going to do? You're her position. What do you do? What am I going to do? You know, can I make these slaves work? No, not really. Uh, and there were some men there on the plantation, but they were from up north and they were building it. And if you go down there to see it, you really should check it out, because uh, they only completed like the bottom part of the house, and the upper stories were not completed. And when those guys, they came from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and places up north, they were skilled artisans, and they had been brought in to do this lavish project that Mr. Nutt wanted done. Well, when the war broke out, they dropped their stuff and took off and went up north, and I would assume it's likely that they would have joined the northern states to put down this rebellion and be close to their kinfolks and stuff like that. And if you go there, you'll see their paint buckets are still right where they left them. Paint brushes, boxes of supplies and stuff. It's all right there. It's still sitting there, and it's passed through a couple different owners over the years, but it's I may be wrong about this, but I think it's a family now from Texas that owns that place. And a stipulation that they have is that it can't be completely built. It has to be left like that so people can see. So anyway, so Miss Nutt, the baller lady, Miss Nutt, with all her slaves and her giant house that her husband was building her. Do you know that she got in a wagon? She had some chickens. She looked around and she said, well, what do I have? And she realized that she did have some chickens. And she took her kids in a wagon, and she was taking eggs down to the city corners in Natchez, on the street corners, selling eggs out of a buckboard wagon. Can you believe that? And to make a long story short, what I mean is this. Well, They bet all that stuff on cotton. And that's true, it was king. But they had no other thought as to how they might make it, or what world conditions might bring to their circumstances, or whether or not they could make it without cotton. It's like they took all their money and put it on black and spin the wheel, see what happens. And it's a foolish thing to do. And nowadays, you could say that some people like that are so foolhardy and impulsive, I guess, with their money, that maybe they will take a home equity loan and put it all on some cryptocurrency that nobody's ever heard of. You could do that. It's a risky thing to do, and something I wouldn't recommend at all. But that's what they did. And today, if you look at Bitcoin, there's a lot of people they're probably millionaires on paper right now with Bitcoin, and they can pop their collar and talk about how rich they are, and they can start building a giant mansion just like Mr. Nutt. They can do that. They might not live to see it built just like he didn't, and their wife or husband might end up trying to sell eggs or something less savory if they find themselves in dire circumstances. So don't do that to yourself. Think a little bit. Diversify what you're doing, and try to have a backup plan. Some people like to have a plan B or something like that. Now, in my case, I'm you can call me a little bit paranoid. Maybe I am, but I believe in having a plan B, C, D, and E. And I don't know if you ever heard the expression, two is one and one is none. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. And you hear this a lot of times with investments. They say diversify your portfolio, and the thought behind it is that if you have a bunch of things in your portfolio and one thing goes down and another thing goes up that's within that portfolio, that you'll have stability as a result, or that's the hope anyway. And it may not be the case, but that's the hope. And just in case you think that's some kind of novel idea, well, that's what all the hedge funds are doing, and that's what all the mutual funds are doing, and all the ETFs and all these things that maybe you have shares of already. They're all doing that. Uh, they would get fired. A finance guy would get fired if he took all of the investors' money and put it on a single stock. They don't do that. And in fact, if an analyst recommended that, they would probably be fired, or they'd want to know who hired them, or something like that. It's a terribly risky thing to do, and it's ill-advised. That's for sure. So diversify your portfolio and try to have different things within it. And I don't mean like a whole bunch of different stocks, because that's still stocks. You know, think about other things. Have bonds, have stocks, have gold, have silver. Do a little crypto if that's your thing. But whatever you do, don't put it all on black and spin the wheel like Mr. and Mrs. Nutt, because you might wind up with a house that's not completed and be in some terrible circumstances. And I know you don't want that. And along those same lines, a lot of times you hear about investments, and investing in a diversified way. But the same is true, although most people don't think about it, with your employment. And there's a lot of people, even people in finance, and may be kind of ironic, I think it is, but they're so diligent and so scrupulous and dedicated to having diversification with their investments, but they're not diversified at all in terms of their employment. They have all their eggs in one basket with an employer. And so if the company that you work for goes belly up, or maybe it was started by a super genius and later it's run by a collection of idiots, it might go under. They might close the store. They might shut down the factory. They might do any number of things, and that are all out of your control. These are larger circumstances that you will be subject to should they happen. And, you want to prepare yourself for that. So consider diversification. Look at plans B, C, D, and E. And make sure that if you're going to build something nice for your wife, that you can complete it. Jesus talked about that. He talked about if you're going to build something, first consider the cost and whether or not you'll be able to complete it. You know? So I want you to complete what you start and to do well and to not be embarrassed by not having planned or have your wife in a terrible circumstance because you didn't think about the possibilities in the future. And of course the Civil War, this is a very rare event, and I guess no one could really foresee that. But uh, just think about the future and try to do as best you can, and work on having a backup plan. Anyway, this is Dan, and I hope you're doing well. And look, it's the Underground Railroad. Let's get to a better place.